Hi everybody, we want to be talking about another instalment in the City and Guilds woodwork course. This time we're looking at the subject of power tools. Now we've already dealt with power tools quite extensively in chapter 3, so we don't need to say too much there. And also large machinery. Now large machinery was also dealt with. That was in chapter 3. So we just want to remind people that when you're doing bench joinery, very often you'll use a chop saw, very often you'll use a mortise or a bandsaw, and you might even use a spindle moulder. So these are all the main machines that are the life and breath of a bench joiner. Now we're also going to be talking about some driving and fixing tools and materials. First of all, we need to talk about hammers. I've got a few hammers here with me to just demonstrate for you. This is a hammer which is of a French type, which I picked up in France. It is it's particularly heavy. It has a 21-ounce hammer. You'll notice it's more like a pick than anything, but it is extremely useful. It has a gadget on the top there, which enables a nail to be just clicked into place so that you can hold the timber, bash the nail in, and then you can carry on nailing the hammer, the nail in. So they're not very sophisticated, but they are exceptionally good, and I highly recommend them to anybody. We also have Warrington hammers. Now I tend to have two types of Warrington hammers. I have a 10-ounce, which is this one, and I have a 5-ounce, which is this one. You can imagine the difference between the two. One is for large pins, and the other one is for small pins. And I also have another little hammer, which is a beautiful little thing, not very heavy at all, and I like to use it for small panel pins. Okay, it's particularly good for that. As far as striking tools, I also use this if I'm working on a large roof. I very often will have this near. You can see all the features. You can pull nails. It's got a massive crowbar effect on there, but on this end you'll notice I'm able to take hold of whole joists like that and lever them either way, and then I can turn around and I can pop nails in. I can also use this as a pry bar. I can pull that in and pull it up. This is particularly heavy. It's about 25 to 26 ounces, very heavy indeed, but particularly good. It's excellent when you're working on roofing. And then lastly, this is what I call Madame Tootsie. Now this is just a very basic, simple rubber mallet. I have wooden mallets, but when I'm working on a site, I don't really want to be taking a wooden mallet on site. So if I'm going on site, I very often will take this one with me. I can use this for on any types of chisels. It's never going to do any harm to them. Interesting enough, it's a little heavier than a wooden mallet, and so therefore you get a lot more power for your buck. And of course I always have nail punches handy. I have 2 or 3 sets. They're usually in my belts, so I'm able to just pick them out. Sometimes when you want to actually pop a nail below the surface, and a little nail punch will punch it below the surface. We also need to talk about adhesives, and there's mainly 2 types at the moment that's in use. Well, there's a few types we'll mention, but PVA is the one that's pretty well universal. It's the old wood glue that's white. Everybody knows what that looks like. And then there's polyurethane. Now this polyurethane looks a little bit like runny honey, and when you pour it, as soon as it comes into contact with moisture, as soon as it comes into contact with the air, it starts to go into a chemical reaction and it expands. It's great for woodwork because it tends to expand and fill any gaps and secure them very well. However, if the gaps are big, it will expand into large bubbles, and then of course when it then sets, it isn't completely filling all the space. There's also urea formaldehyde, which is a very fine glue, which you then mix with a bit of water, and that tends to foam up as well. And that's also very good for gap filling. And then of course there's what's called panel adhesive, which people talk about grip fill as being a panel adhesive. I'm not quite sure that that's the case. The panel adhesive is very runny, and it was used to put onto panels years ago, and people would put it onto wooden panels and they stick the panels to the wall to make the walls look like wooden walls. That's what panel adhesive is, and it's exceptionally good. It's a little bit slower setting than things like grit fill. Grip fill tends to skin over very quickly, and sometimes it doesn't really have the bond that we really need. But because panel adhesive is a little bit more fluid, it's a little bit more sticky. Okay, and what we normally do with panel adhesive is we put the board on, take the board off, give it 20 seconds and then put it back on again, and it is effectively a contact adhesive. Now you can also buy contact adhesive in tins, and it's the typical stuff that you take out and you spread it onto one piece of board, and you might spread onto a nice piece of plastic laminate, and then you let them dry for a little while, and then as soon as you put them together, as soon as they come into contact, they stick and they cannot be moved. That's why it's called a contact adhesive. There's lots of types for fixings, and we talked about them in chapter 3, so we won't go into all those again, but we will say that cramping devices are very, very important, and we haven't really mentioned them that much. The most important cramping device you'll need as a joiner is, of course, your woodworking bench, your woodworking vise. And this, of course, is attached to your bench at all times, and it just is absolutely irreplaceable. If you can have 2 on a bench, then it's even more fantastic. And of course, there's lots of different hold down devices nowadays for woodworking bench. The next one is the sash clamp. Now this is a long bar with a threaded component at one end that actually turns, and it actually threads along a large clamp. At the other end there will be a sliding feature that will actually be held by the use of pegs. So that's a sash clamp, an indispensable piece of equipment, and you'll need lots of them. You'll need very big ones, medium size, and very small ones. And of course there's the G clamp, and guess what shape it is? It's in the shape of a capital G. They're particularly useful, although actually they were frowned upon in our workshop when I was a lad because of the turning effect. That if you're going around a frame and you give this a turn and that a turn and that a turn, all in the same direction, then don't be surprised if the frame itself twists. That's the point. Then of course we have the F clamp. This is just basically very similar to a sash clamp, except that it's the other way around. So the thing that actually turns is the thing that slides along the bar, but it's called an F clamp. And then there's various other proprietary clamps of all different shapes and sizes and varieties, and I have lots of them. I have really big ones, and I have the smaller ones and smaller ones and smaller ones and smaller ones, right the way down to little tiny ones, because of course you never, if I might say so, have enough clamps. So that's how we actually fix things together. If you're going to glue and you're going to do something like that, then you'll certainly need to have clamps. Now, as for the types of joints, I'm just going to reel off the types of joints. Some of them you will already know exactly what they are. There's a thing called the butt joint. Now, the butt joint is where 2 pieces of wood are just brought together. They're not fixed inside each other, they're just sitting on top of each other, and of course you then would want to put some nails or some screws and a bit of glue, or you might actually screw some screws or some nails, what they're called knitting together. As the nails go through, they do this effect, and that effect knits them together. They cannot, if they went in like that, they could slide out, but when they're knitted against each other, they can't slide out very well. And then of course there's halving joints. Now a halving joint is quite simply where half of the timber is cut out on both pieces, and because half of the timber is cut out on one and half of it's cut out on the other, they just come together and they still are then the overall thickness of the main timber. And of course you can have a T halving joint and you can have a cross halving joint. These joints are not particularly that secure, and of course you can have the dovetail halving joint. They're not particularly secure without glue and screw, so that's the particular feature of those joints. Now the bridle joint is a little bit like a mortise and tenon, except the opposite way around. So if you can imagine a tenon here, and this is the bridle comes over like the horse's mouth does to a bridle. He just comes over and holds it. If there was some more timber on this side and it slid on this way, it would then be a mortise and tenon joint, wouldn't it? But a halving joint is, a bridle joint is one of those joints which isn't used very often. It isn't used very often. The only place I know where a bridle joint is used is on the meeting stile of the bottom of a sliding sash. There we are. That's the place where a bridle is used. Then of course there's the housing joint. Housing joint is when you have a vertical piece of timber and you take a slot out of it and then you feed something into the slot. And there's lots of ways in which this is done. It's used, for example, in cupboards, and it's used at the heads of door linings. And then of course we have the mitre. Now the mitre is a joint, and it's where two pieces are coming across, usually at 90 degrees, and where they meet there's a special angled cut where they both come and touch together. And then of course there's lengthening joints. Say you've got a piece of skirting and it isn't long enough to do a whole room, then you might want to join the two together, and that means a mitre on both pieces, and they both come across, and they just the one can sink into the other. It almost looks as if it's an unbroken piece of timber all the way along. And then of course there's the mortise and tenon. Now the mortise and tenon, as I said, has been demonstrated on another video, but the mortise and tenon is the most common joint in all the world. It's on doors, it's on windows, it's on everything. And the other thing is, it's nearly always a haunched mortise and tenon. A haunched mortise and tenon is where the tenon comes across into a piece of timber, but because there's a bit missing on the tenon, that little piece there's missing, it means that inside the mortise there can be some extra timber. If there was not extra timber, then it would then slide off the top. Okay, it would be effectively a bridle joint. And then of course we have dovetail joints. Now dovetail joints are not used very often. They're used in the top rail of a sliding sash window. Okay, that's the only place where I know that they're used in general carpentry, but they are also then used on traditional furniture. They're used, for example, as a through through dovetail at the rear of a drawer, and they're used as a stopped dovetail at the front of a drawer. Okay, these are the two places where dovetails are used. And then of course we then have edge joints. Edge joints are where boards are joined to other boards, and of course we might use biscuits to join the two together, or dominoes. They have special dominoes, or they have a loose tongue, which is a long piece of plywood that actually goes into a groove on both surfaces and they just come together. Or it might be dowels coming from one board into another. These are the standard ways in which we tend to join timber on edge. Good, well we look forward to speaking to you on the next video. So have a good day and bye for now.